You are listening to the Worlding Podcast, where we explore the relationship of how we are both shaping and being shaped by our surroundings. The podcast traces interconnections by inviting each episode's guest to pass on the mic to someone who has influenced their world. And now, here's your host, dance artist Renae Shadler.
Hello friends. Today we're starting a new string figure with my guest, Siegmar Zacharias. Siegmar is a performance artist and researcher whose works produce situations of embodied thinking and sensing together with and through materiality. In this episode, we will focus on her recent research into collective forms of grieving and how this works with the Polyvagal Theory, the materiality within our own bodies, which was coined by American neuroscientist Stephen Porges. Hi Siegmar, thanks for joining us today.
Hi Renae, thank you for the invitation.
To begin, can you share with listeners your current surroundings and how they're shaping you in this conversation right now?
Yes, so I'm sitting at the kitchen table and there's 2 huge pomegranates, a cup of tea, a book called How We Die is How We Live, Only More So, by Ori Dashri, and a few tinctures that have been sitting on my windowsill and that I have to shake every day and that have to kind of extract the stuff from the plants in the next 2 months.
Wow. It feels very layered, actually, as I think about the plants and the books and different lifespans of how long things exist for. I just wanted to linger a little bit with the book you mentioned, because diving into this topic of grief and especially looking at it through your research around materiality, how have you come to this theme in your work at the moment?
It's hard for me to call it a theme in a way, because it's something that has been part of my life for a long time now. On the one hand, I've been working around the questions of death and finitude on a philosophical level for quite some time, but then about 4 years ago, my sister got diagnosed with an autoimmune illness, and which she was supposed to live with, but then died within half a year. So we shared a very intense and very open conversation of how this relationship is going to be changed by death and dying, although we thought it was going to take much longer. But we had a very intimate bond, and we could embrace this new entity in our relationship and really see how it was changing it. And then she died, and then the grief was a very different work. And in a way, I'm doing this research still with her together, although she's not physically present anymore.
And I know during this process you also trained as a death doula, which I think is something that's been in cultures for a very long time, but is not so familiar to a lot of people. A doula is similar to a midwife during the birthing process, or a doula during the birthing process, but really assists this process of dying, especially within family structures. How is that training for you, and how has that impacted your performance practice?
I think I decided to do that because I realized that being and dying with my sister was something I could do, that being part of that process in a way, and being a companion and being attending to this transition, and also all the obstacles that are happening in that transition, was something that I felt I could do. So I wanted to see how what else there was that I should know about it if I wanted to work with other people. But then the other thing is really also that I'm seeing my artistic practice as a practice of a death doula, or like originally they called it end-of-life doula, but it's not, for me, it's not just restricted to one person or the death of an individual, but also processes of death and dying that are collective, and possibly to the question of, in what kind of a transition are we as the human race, or as a humanity, or as how can we attend to them and become attentive to those processes of change.
I think that also ties in very nicely with the polyvagal theory and this idea of co-regulating nervous systems. I feel like at the moment during the pandemic, when a lot of us are isolated or in various stages of lockdown, this idea of collectivity and learning with and through other systems is really missing, or perhaps that's the wrong word, transforming into something else. Can you talk a little bit about how that has also affected this idea of collectivity and really focusing on grief and grieving together?
So the polyvagal theory was something that I was introduced to by Neha Chris, who is a friend and a sound artist and a trans activist. And together with her, we were exploring already how we could maybe create spaces where this kind of interlinking of nervous systems could become sensible. And so Steve Porges describes the vagus nerve as two, and it has two branches. The one branch goes to the side and goes in front and kind of regulates the lung and the heart and the throat and the larynx, and the other one goes down to the abdomen. And both are responsible for the autonomic functionings of these organs, so breathing, heartbeat, digestion. And breathing is special because breathing has both the automatic and the voluntary possibility. But what he describes so strongly is that not only does the information go down from the brain to these organs, but actually we get a lot of feedback back to the brain. And so he developed this in his work with people on the autistic spectrum and post-traumatic syndromes, and saying basically kind of wanting to prepare the ground to go away from trauma work being verbal work, like being only focused on making sense of things, but to work from the body and with the body. And so as the vagus nerve is responsible also for the fight, flight, and freeze response, we have the parasympathetic strand that is normally called is responsible for resting and digesting, but he calls it the social engagement. And that is something very beautiful to kind of think. And this is where it becomes interesting in how kind of bodily engagement can feed back on a physiological level into a neurological level, into a psychological feedback loop, and from then on into a social feedback loop. So I can work on the body and create sensations, reactions that might enable me to encounter the world differently. And as I'm encountering the world differently, I can engage with the world differently. And so there are 4 feedback loops that kind of create the relation, or are part of creating relationship. And so the question is, if there are situations that bring us immediately into this panic state or into a shutdown state, what would be the situations, or what would it need to come into the social engagement state? And I think that was where Neha and I at that time started thinking through. It's like, how can we create, or what could be artistic proposals to create spaces where social engagement becomes possible. And just because you mentioned it before, one thing more is like, so what he's saying is that there's a self-regulation that is happening where the body is helping itself into homeostasis again. But furthermore, and this is actually the new thing, he pointed out that we also have the capacity to co-regulate. So co-regulation is basically the situation when you come into a room, you feel perfectly calm, but as soon as you enter the room, you get a sense of panic. And within 10 minutes, you're panicking yourself. Or the other way around, you are quite worked up and you come into a room and there is a complete sense of calm, of joyfulness, of connection. And that also starts influencing you. And it's not just because you tell yourself to be calm. There's something that's happening there that is determined by the connection of the nervous systems. And there's practitioners that work with this idea of cultural somatics, of how we, in a certain point of time, can influence each other, but of course also over time into pasts and futures that we have shared, so that these nervous systems are really like mycelia that are connected, not in a linear way, but more in a kind of way of fielding, so to speak.
I think that's also very telling of this idea of worlding. Like, we're talking about the nervous systems within other human bodies that affect us. Like if somebody has kind, open eyes, or is speaking in a grounded voice, for example. And then I definitely feel that from a surrounding perspective as well. If I walk into a room and there's a lot of natural light, there are low frequencies happening from different areas, perhaps a rustling of some leaves, or it's a quieter space after coming inside from walking along a busy street, for example. Can you talk a little bit to that and this kind of interchange also with the surroundings, just to play on that thought a little bit?
So interesting to, just because you mentioned the low frequency. Low frequency is actually something that happens, that the nervous system reacts with arousal, meaning that it gets heightened, because low frequencies are the thing that when we're still surrounded by tigers might have meant tiger growling. I'm saying this because Stephen Porges also did this Safe and Sound protocol, which is an acoustic intervention, a therapeutic acoustic intervention, which is a kind of 5-day protocol that you do in the presence of a therapist, exactly for this reason of co-regulation. And there they worked a lot with taking out all the low frequencies and then just staying in a kind of higher mid-range, which is basically the kind of, it's the human calm voice. So it's not too high, it's also not too low. It's this kind of, he sometimes refers to it as the mother's voice, but it could be any caretaker's voice, really.
So interesting. I actually grew up on the coast. I think I mentioned it a few times in this podcast, the coast in Western Australia. And for me, the low frequency is like the waves, like this kind of low crashing and rolling back in. I think it's one of the calmest sounds for me. Whereas high pitch, I think of like police sirens, or like an alarm clock waking me up. But yeah, of course, there are different associations. It's very interesting.
I think definitely they don't refer to the to that highness or kind of high pitch of the siren. It's really more the human voice frequency, and also not as a scream. It's a kind of as we speak now, basically. And I relate very much to what you say about the low frequency and the rolling of the waves. I think what is happening there for me is that we sense the low frequencies stronger because they go through the body in a more palpable way, so they become sensible actually, rather than only hearable. I mean, this is one of the works that it kind of goes to for me, which is actually called Waves. That sound waves are really the thing that we cannot protect ourselves from, that they engage on a material level with the body and not just on an acoustic or understanding what you're hearing level.
That's a really nice thread, I think, with the materiality and the research into materiality. Like I have from this conversation a kind of density perhaps in the grieving process, a coming together that feels very thick. And now as we start to talk about the sound waves, I love that I just mentioned waves and the project's called Waves, and sound emits waves. I promise listeners that was not predetermined in any way. But yeah, that again becomes a materiality in your practice and the way you are connecting threads of thought.
Yeah, I think, I mean, for me, the waves, I want to go a step back actually, even because we were talking about death and dying before, and in a way, part of the work or the death work around this is to accept and to value and to appreciate and to attend to the materiality of death and dying, and start becoming receptive to them. So that means, like, even in this, like, people always say, you know, there is nothing left when a person dies and the so-called soul disappears, and then it's just the carcass and it's just the empty, what is it called in English? It's just the kind of die erdliche Hülle of German. So it's just the packaging.
But the shell, you could say the shell of a human remains. Yeah.
Yes. But actually, I mean, I remember with my father dying, or my father being dead, because I wasn't there when he died, but how much I appreciated to actually see the progression of processes. So, and to feel and to sense them. So, you know, to smell the sense, to smell the scent that develops, to realize that the change in color and the change in smell is because other organisms that have been part of him, bacteria and things, are actually thriving. You know, there is a change in almost like in valences, who is attending to whom, but actually the materiality of the body is still there, and it's very much still in process. And it's just that this process continues differently without the functioning of the organs. That's also one of the things that I was that maybe brought me to this question, or to this research, to this interest in, like, how is the body actually part of a materiality, and possibly also of an uncontrollable materiality that we are constantly engaging with.
I really just want to play also with this idea of uncontrollable, to share also from my lived experience, my grandmother passed away when I was younger, around 13 years old, and I was actually with her when she died. My mother had organised for her to be released from the hospital, and we had a hospital bed in our lounge room, and the immediate family were there. And I remember her passing around 11 p.m. at night and having quite a peaceful process, I would say. She really looked at us all in the eye one by one, and then her tongue gently rolled into the back of her throat, and there was a little gargle, which I would say perhaps was a low frequency. It definitely made my nervous system feel a little bit on edge. Yeah, and then she was no longer breathing, and the next day, as a child, I felt like she needed to leave the house. There was that feeling of like, this is strange. My grandmother is different. She's not talking anymore. Like, I'm feeling a little bit uncomfortable. There wasn't that familiarity with death, which perhaps in previous generations there had been. Like, I think there is also that separation now of living and death, which is another wormhole to go down for sure. But it was very uncontrollable how quickly other forces took over. It was summer in Australia. It was hot. She was a large woman. She was perspiring a lot. The skin wasn't absorbing now the sweat, so it became quite sticky. Yeah, and the smell was very palpable. But there was that collectivity, actually, the fact my mother was so relaxed and it was so important for her to be there. Everybody was calming me down in that process. And I could also begin actually to appreciate the beauty in it, something that, in the Hollywood blockbusters is disgusting and you cover it in a white sheet. It was really that idea of a collective grieving, I would say, and witnessing of the materiality changing.
That's beautiful. Thanks for sharing that. It's also a very special thing as a child to have memories of how the community around you does this. So, for example, my great-grandmother was a lament singer, like a wailing woman in her village and in Romania, and they would always be called the wailing women to wail to the dead. So they sing to the dead. So there is also this kind of possessed action. I mean, this is how it was perceived in Romania anyway, to kind of say this is a kind of certain tongue. And the vigil is 3 days long, and this thing of like how the wailing holds the situation and lets people go through these waves of emotion, and also really helps releasing the breath that people tend to hold because grief is a stressor for the nervous system for sure. But then how, because it's an extreme change, like basically every extreme change, and the loss is an extreme change. How do you kind of adapt to that? And in a way, this different grieving practices we can see also as ways to adapt with the situation, with an extreme change, and to be in the situation that you just described, where you were welcomed into, or you were invited into, just the being with the process of decay, and being with experiencing the loss of the person you had a relation to, and having another relation to, having to start to build another relationship to, in that with the same person that in a lot of ways wasn't the same anymore. I think it's very beautiful to learn that, or to have experiences of that at such young age, because I think this is something that we're missing at the moment, or at least in this part of the world, that the grief is something that is extreme, is disruptive. People have patience with it for about a year, and then you have to be over it. But a lot of people who have had like intimate grief relationships will share this maybe to say that actually you never get over it. You learn to live with it differently. And I started looking at how does it make me learn to live, and how does it make me want to live also? Because in this, if grief is a reaction to a certain loss, then there's a whole kind of recalibration, reconstellation, let's say, of world. I mean, a lot of part of grief is kind of reworlding. And here we are with your podcast, but it is really a kind of how am I in the world? How is the world in me? And how do we relate to each other? And especially with griefs that are in the world at the moment, there is no end point. So, I mean, maybe even if you think that, this person has died, it's been several years now, you should be over it. And what do you do with the grief that comes because of climate change, for example, which is going to be an ongoing process of losses, definitely until the end of my lifetime, and probably everybody's lifetime. So how do you, what's the end point to a grief like that? So in a way, I think part of my research and part of my desire to work with this, also on an artistic level, is to kind of ask how can we train, how we can rehearse living with grief as making futures, because we will not get rid of it.
It also really resonates with me, this idea of poly, like we've been talking about the polyvagal theory, but actually in the idea of grieving collectively, can there be a polyphony of responses, like talking about the different rituals around death, perhaps within my family, within the traditions in Romania. How can we allow for many situations and many feelings to coexist and come in waves? Like, I know personally through the process of grief, there are very strong waves that hit you, and then it's interesting if the space, if the surroundings can hold that, if the community of humans you're with can hold that or support that. And as you said, when that allowance shifts, I think it's really interesting at the moment with Corona that if someone has a positive test, they can't do anything and it's not questionable. There isn't that kind of side comment of like, oh, but maybe you could just do a few hours on your emails, or maybe you could just come in for a few hours. You're out, And I feel like as a society, this process of grief and grieving, there is that time period of like, okay, be productive now, like that process is gone, or the little side comment of like, oh, I know the funeral's at midday, but in the afternoon, would you be available slightly? Could you talk a little bit about that flexibility of time and how we can approach this polyphony of responses collectively without there being some judgment or shame around diverse responses?
Yeah, I mean, I think I can hear two questions in there at least. Like, one is to the different ways to respond to grief, and also how it kind of comes over you in different waves at different times. And I think that is part of for me, the uncontrollable materiality of grief for me is the bodies and the relationships of bodies, and not only human bodies. So I think there is no right or wrong way of grieving. That's one of the things already that I think just to kind of tell people what to do is doesn't work, or to try to help them. I mean, I think one of the best things that we can do to each other is to be present for each other and attend, almost in this, like to be, I mean, this is something a lot of people say, just be present and listen. And in a way that ties back to the co-regulation, like you don't need to actually do something if you are there and open-hearted. And this is, we're still talking only about humans with humans. But I think there are other relationships that we're engaging with also. And I think part of the practice would be to understand if we're all constantly grieving, maybe in different intensities, but we're in a process of grieving and getting used to grieving, then what we could do for each other is take turns in holding each other's pain and being present with each other's pain, and practice this vulnerability towards each other. I think that's one of the things, and also to realize that when we're doing that, when I'm on the receiving end of this, like I'm on the receiving end of your presence to my pain, let's say, then I also sense how I go through processes, and that I can be in another state in some time. And so also to learn that grief is not a complete state of unsafety that brings up all these fight, fright, and freeze responses, but it's a huge, it's painful, it might be threatening, but it might not be. I might perceive it as threatening, but it doesn't have to destroy me. So how do we learn to live in this or with this senses and waves of discomfort, let's say, also? Maybe that's one thing, and I think that's something that I'm definitely trying to create situations of in the listening sessions where you feel different people go through different points of discomfort in it, and yet kind of experience places of comfort, or of actually more of a kind of being held in a different way. But the other thing about the time, I think this question of time and when people have no time for your grief anymore is really, I don't know. I think insofar grief is probably really a practice of resistance, or of actually more of queering than of resistance, because it's actually just not, it cannot be captured by questions of functionability and production. Like, that's one of the things that a lot of people say, that under grief I can't function. I just don't function, and I don't know what to do, and I can't produce anything. And for me, this personal grief and this collective grief, because of bigger events that are bigger than me, and in a way grief is always bigger than me, but because it lets me touch other times and other spaces, or it brings me in connection to them. But like really processes like climate change or the pandemic are such that we don't know what to do with the idea that production and functioning has a certain timeline, because it just doesn't work with the bodies that are in this time. So that's, I don't know, that was a very kind of winded way of talking about it, but yeah.
But in a way, actually very concrete. I appreciate it a lot, because there is this, collective holding, as you said, for the waves of grief, and then this question of duration. And it does also this metaphor of a pandemic, which is very real, and we're living it, but in a way from a different perspective can really open up like a lot of possibilities for something that's ongoing and unstable and unknown. that we watch unravel and we witness unravel over time. I think it's really testing our capacities to allow that, to be flexible in schedule, to really be off.
I'm just wondering if it can't create another relation to time, so that we don't just think of it as let's be more flexible, but what if the whole contract has to shift? What if, maybe there's different ways to making contract than to squeeze like 5 Zoom meetings in a day and then forget the performance online that I wanted to go to, or in real life also, and that I wanted to go to just because there's so much happening at the same time. So sometimes, this is something I'm struggling with, but I do ask myself constantly if I can't find a different relationship to it.
Yeah.
Because to think that we can just stretch the system that we had is not good, is somehow not satisfying, and it also doesn't really work.
Yeah, I really like the idea of emergence, actually, and allowance, this allowance of the many reactions, the allowance of different times, different durations of grief, how to find that within kind of more structured or work-orientated timescales is a big proposition and something to kind of sit with for a long time, I think.
So one of the things, for example, that I started doing was these listening sessions that I mentioned before that were called Waves, listening session towards social bodies. And it really came from the lockdown situation. And I have been doing a lot of very immersive, visceral works. And I realized I can't, that's not going to happen. So how can I get in real touch? How can I provide a space that is immersive and physical that could work in a remote way? And so I started working with these sounds and sound waves. And so there it is, for example, a very, very local, very kind of timely restricted space. So in this space, we're listening together to a sound piece, and then afterwards, we also try to exchange something or share something of the experience. And even remotely, I was interested if we could have this sensation not just of self-perception through the maybe shifting proprioception because of the sound waves, but more, and also the interlink between the sound waves and the nervous system, because this is the material that we worked with was really trying to work on the nervous system also. But also if the co-presence of people remotely would help to get a sense of co-regulation, to get a sense of co-presence, even though it was taking place on Zoom. And there were some really beautiful moments where I would ask people always to kind of take a heavy object and lay it on themselves, and to please leave the camera on, and even if they don't want to be in the image, just point it somewhere. And so we had there were some very beautiful images of empty rooms, or corners of rooms basically, but together they collected this one shared space of presence-absence.
Oh, that's beautiful.
Yeah. And then the other thing that I've been doing, this is why I have the tinctures, is that I started working with plants and thinking of like building a grief garden, that where basically the gardening and the tending to plants is the space of sharing and creating grieving practices that are, because grieving practices don't have to be wailing like my great-grandmother did. Grieving practice also could be being together in a space that we declare into a grieving practice, and then what takes place inside of it could also be joyous laughter. This is, for example, what happens often at vigils, that people are also having a lot of fun. It's not just about sadness and tears. So how can even this fun be part of attending to our different grieves?
Do you find that different people attend both, that would come to a Waves listening session and also spend time in the garden? Or is it really, do you find like certain nervous systems have tendencies towards certain frameworks?
There are some people who attend to both. There's also very different audience, so to speak, because I'm kind of shifting from the idea of audience, although I work with acoustics now, but to more like publics, because this is where the research really started, with this question of what is it to do grieve privately and what is it to do grieve collectively and publicly, and how can we actually never be alone? I mean, why shouldn't we be alone in grief? But actually also, how are we not alone in grief ever? And then how to acknowledge that and actually create collective public spaces where we can do grief work together. And the garden space is at Nachbarschaftscampus in Neukölln, and works, which is really nested in a big social housing thing called Weiße Siedlung. And so we work a lot with people with migration backgrounds from there. And so that is also a very different grief work, which is basically really also just providing space for processing structural violences, actually.
Wow, maybe that's a future iteration of placing the Waves listening within the garden or something like this. Like, I wonder if we can, again, with this like multiple responses to grief, be in the kind of somatic listening internal space while also experiencing this joy. Because I often have that, I think, when I'll be in like a celebratory space, but inside feel quite melancholy or slow. Like, how can we mix things together and allow that to be okay? I guess, again, with this worlding of being in a freezing situation outside in a Berlin winter, but there being sunshine, for example. This is just an interest at the moment. So something to leave with you, perhaps.
Yeah, but I think it's really at least for me, it's becoming clearer and clearer that part of, if we accept that we will be grieving for the rest of our lives, but in different ways, and what these different ways could be, and if building futures has to necessarily incorporate this capacity to grieve collectively, then how do we build joyous futures? So that these two things aren't mutually exclusive at all.
Absolutely.
My whole desire, my whole work is to create collective and public places for grief work and to see how performance is part of this. And so the conversations and the practices and the exchanges that flow into this work are like year-long exchanges with Erica Nichols, for example, who is a choreographer and who's been working around death rituals and grief for ages. The Wave, the listening series, was a collaboration where I invited 4 different composers to make a listening session. So there were Niha, who I mentioned before, Niha Chris and Sam Hertz and Judy Harmon. And then I made 3 together with Steve Heather. And then they were hosted by the Finzel and FFT. So it's a lot of people who are interested to see how we can expand this conversation, how we can hold space. Then also the Nachbarschaftsgarten, the Social Body Apothecary project that I mentioned, is a collaboration between Shelley Etkin, who is a choreographer and land artist, and Kitty Singer, who is an artist and engineer. So, and then Anna Di Carlo, who invited us into this garden. It's very exciting, but it's also very beautiful to see that, it takes a village to be with grief.
During this conversation, you've mentioned a few propositions, and I would love if you could share one with listeners and myself so we can really embody these themes and conversations, which, as we established, are even more than themes. They're really life processes of grieving and co-regulating our nervous system.
Yeah, I'd love to. Maybe what we could do is I would invite you, dear listener, to take one headphone out if you're wearing headphones. And what I'd like you to do is to find a heavy object that you place on yourself. I will probably take one of these huge pomegranates. And then just sit and listen to your surroundings and try to pick the lowest frequency that you can hear, since we've spoken about low frequencies. So see what the low frequency is that you hear, if it's a fridge or if it's the street or whatever it could be that's around you. And then try to hum with it. And as you're humming, you can first just hum and then see how the humming travels through your body and until it's kind of moving like waves maybe, or maybe it moves differently in you. Just see how the hum moves through all the liquids and open spaces and different kind of textures and densities of your body. So we'll do that together for about 2 minutes, and then I'll invite you back. So I have my pomegranate. Do you have something, Renae?
Yeah, I have a glass of water on my shoulder.
Great.
Let's begin.
Okay. Welcome back. So yeah, that would be one proposition.
Thank you.
And I don't know how it was for you, but I found myself swaying as I was doing it.
I'm standing up actually, and I really needed to bend my knees. Like I really felt like weighted, not so much swaying, more like getting closer to the ground. And like my pelvis really feels like a bowl of water. I don't know if that's also part of it, but I had my glass of water on my shoulder and you mentioned the liquids in the body and everything started to swim.
That's beautiful. So we had the ocean, the waves, and the bowl of your pelvis.
I think I might lead into a departure on these very deep and resonant feelings and sound frequencies. If listeners would like to experience Siegmar's practice live, I would invite you to a free hybrid lab, which means it happens online and in presence in Kreuzberg, Berlin. And Siegmar will be facilitating Moving Across Thresholds, another shared format that I'm curating on the 21st of April, and all listeners are warmly invited. I know a few people are listening from America and in the Nordic region, so if you're one of those listeners, also feel free to go online and join us. You can find the information at www.movingacrossthresholds.com, and I'll also put the link in the show notes. I'm really looking forward to that session, Siegmar.
Yeah, me too.
I will come with my water bodies. And to continue this conversation, who have you lined up to speak with us for the next episode?
I love connecting you with Zinzi Buchanan. Their work revolves around death, love, sickness, and divination. And they've just finished working on the Sick Bed series and are going towards working around ancestral trauma healing. And I love listening to them speaking about their work.
Wonderful. I'm looking forward to that conversation, and thank you so much for this beautiful offering. Have a wonderful day.
Thank you for the invitation. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you for listening to the Worlding Podcast. Gefördert durch die Beauftragte der Bundesregierung für Kultur und Medien im Programm Neustart Kultur. Hilfsprogramm des Tanzen des Dachverband Tanz Deutschland.